Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a new book that is available on Kindle, and it is called Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. 50 pages long, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. Other than that, it's $3.99. So again, that is Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. And now, on with the podcast.
Does your wife watch any of these games with you? Does she?
No, she has the female complex multitasking brain. That's why they can't be happy. They just always, they're like, what is that lizard that can look at two things at once? That's what they're like. So they got the shoes they want, and then they see some other woman walking in going, oh, look at this skinny bitch over here. She thinks she's cute, right? And that's what I've learned.
Oh, God.
You know what makes women happy? Nothing. Nothing makes them happy, and that is why they are slowly taking over the NFL, because it annoys them that we can just sit there with like a pizza and a drink, like, that's not holding, and just be like, and enjoy ourselves.
So you're saying that because you're happy, that you think your wife and women in general want to take
They're jealous of it. They're jealous how simple the male brain is, that you can just sit there and be entertained and find true happiness, and it just bugs.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, May the 30th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch and rules for retrogrades. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The goal then should not be to manage prices. The goal should be to ensure that prices are free to fluctuate. Therefore, an emphasis should be placed not on containing prices, but on eliminating obstacles that attempt to change prices to something other than what is supported in the marketplace. Christopher Mayer. Policymakers get this wrong constantly, but I am not at all convinced they get it wrong by accident. Ideally, stable prices should be the aim of public policy, with fluctuations coming from those things impacted by human action: effort, demand, tastes, risks, etc. Marketplace forces may change prices, but the centralized planning or manipulation of prices is both distortive and destructive to the very efforts we want from economic actors, namely risk-taking, effort, and productive behavior.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. You know, life is full of pain. That's the first thing we need to admit, because pretending otherwise is a lie. And in that pain and that suffering, we encounter people. Some are good, some are honest, but others are fragmented. They're twisted by insecurity, pride, and the desperate pursuit of validation. We call them liberals. Liberals fear accountability more than guilt. This is a crucial insight into their psychological structure. To understand this, we need to recognize what accountability truly represents to somebody with a liberal disposition. Accountability demands self-awareness. It requires a person to confront the reality of their actions and their impact on others. It asks for internal responsibility and acknowledgement that one's behavior is not only observable, but also morally significant. But for the liberal, this is a terrifying proposition because their entire identity is constructed around an illusion of perfection, superiority, and invulnerability. To be accountable, a person has to admit that they are fallible. But liberals don't see themselves as flawed human beings. They see themselves as this idealized entity, strong, untouchable, righteous, and anything that threatens that illusion is perceived as a mortal threat. It's not just uncomfortable, it's psychologically annihilating. So, when a liberal is confronted with the harm that they've caused, they don't interpret it as a chance to reflect or grow. They see it as an attack, as a dangerous exposure of their fraudulence. And in response, they retreat, they avoid, they ignore. Now, guilt is something we all feel when we transgress our moral boundaries. It's a painful but necessary emotion. It's a signal from our conscience that we've stepped out of alignment with our values. Healthy people feel guilt and they use it as motivation, make amends. But for liberals, guilt is too threatening to allow, not because they don't feel it, but because they can't afford to admit it. Feeling guilty would mean admitting fault would mean acknowledging imperfection, and acknowledging imperfection would mean letting go of the grandiose self-image that keeps their identity intact. So they push guilt aside, they bury it, they replace it with justification, blame, or cold indifference. This is why, after hurting someone, a liberal might seem eerily calm, even detached, while the victim is left reeling, confused, and searching for answers. The liberal appears unaffected, but it's not because they feel no guilt. It's because they fear what that guilt could expose. They fear that if they let the guilt in, even for a moment, the entire facade might crumble. So they do the next best thing. They avoid the situation entirely. They ignore the person they hurt. They pretend the incident never happened. They go stone cold or disappear. It's not an accident. It's not forgetfulness. It's a calculated form of psychological self-protection. Accountability would require them to face not only the pain they caused, but also the reality of who they are when the mask comes off. And for many liberals, that's unbearable. Their inner world is already filled with insecurity, shame, and self-loathing, things they've spent their entire lives trying to cover up. So they created a narrative where they are never wrong. They're always justified. The other person is too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. The relationship was flawed. The argument was trivial. They did what they had to do. These stories aren't just lies they tell others, they're lies they tell themselves to avoid the terror of true accountability. This fear of accountability also explains why liberals are often so skilled at deflecting. They twist conversation, shift blame, and reframe events to maintain the illusion of their own righteousness. If you confront them, they might accuse you of overreacting. If you show them your pain, they might accuse you of being manipulative. It's all part of the same psychological mechanism. Protect the self-image. The truth is too dangerous. The mirror is too clear. So they smash it rather than look into it. What's important to recognize is that this pattern isn't about us. It's not a reflection of our worth, our behavior, or our emotional needs. It's about their inability to tolerate the vulnerability that comes with being wrong. They've built a life, consciously or unconsciously, around the avoidance of shame, and accountability is a direct route to shame. It's a confrontation with the self that says, "You're not who you pretend to be." That is terrifying for a liberal. So rather than face that, they flee, they minimize, they disappear. They choose silence over dialogue, distance over connection, because the alternative threatens the very foundation of their carefully constructed identity. Silence is their shield against shame. When a liberal goes silent after hurting you, it's not a passive act. It's a powerful defensive maneuver. Silence is not merely the absence of words, it is a calculated barrier, a wall of emotional disengagement. For the liberal, silence functions as both escape and control. It removes them from the discomfort of your pain while simultaneously maintaining dominance over the emotional dynamic between us. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 40. Victory loves preparation. This is perhaps both the most fundamental of the rules for retrogrades and the most crucial. It is nothing short of pure hubris to think that we stand any chance of winning a fight against a competent opponent for which we are not adequately prepared. Leading up to a bout, boxers spend months in training camps, immersed in fitness routines, sparring with fighters chosen based on their physical and technical similarity to the upcoming opponent. Before a match, chess masters spend weeks poring over the opening choices, stylistic preferences, and prior games of their rivals. Generals meticulously study the tactics and methods of opposing generals. General Patton, in the run-up to the North Africa campaign in World War II, famously read Erwin Rommel's book, Infantry Attacks. Football coaches sit down weekly to watch film of their upcoming opponents, to get familiar with their roster strengths and playbooks. Why mod cons believe for a second that they have a snowflake's chance in hell of whooping an organized, bankrolled, determined group of radicals just by showing up at the polls every 2 years and perhaps bloviating to insolent nieces and nephews about politics over Thanksgiving dinner is one of the unsolved mysteries of the universe. Too many mod cons earnestly think that because they're nominally on the side of the good, Providence has all but guaranteed them victory in the political cultural wars. Too many mod cons believe that their only duty to their fellow men is to be productive members of society, hold down a steady job, produce a milquetoast family without getting a divorce, harm no one, perhaps go to church on Sunday, and develop acceptably partisan political opinions. They've got another think coming. While victory rests with the Lord, the horse is to be made ready for the day of battle. Living an uninspired, ennui-filled, suburban existence, replete with creature comforts of every sort, doesn't lend itself to wresting control of the West away from radicals, hell-bent on destroying it. As marvelous Marvin Hagler famously quipped, "It's tough to get out of bed to do road work at 5 a.m. when you've been sleeping in silk pajamas." Taking a generally passive approach to the pressing issues of our day, albeit with the tired rationalization that one wants to help but doesn't have time to get involved, is really just sterilized treason against the retrograde cause. What we need is active and uncompromising engagement, and this takes preparation. How can retrogrades prepare themselves to fight and win the political cultural wars? First, we must take great pains to prepare ourselves intellectually for ideological combat. The retrograde must be well versed in classical works of Western political thought, in the philosophy of natural rights and limited government, in the justifications for the free market, in the social kingship of Jesus Christ, and in the doctrines of Christianity. In order to do battle, one must know with great specificity the objectives of the fight, especially when the battle is to take place in the realm of ideas. Achieving a foundational knowledge of the retrograde philosophy is condition precedent for jumping into the fray. Without it, our engagement would be directionless and flailing, and we'd suffer significant attrition to radicals. And no, watching Tucker Carlson every night isn't sufficient either, although God bless him. Once the retrograde has a foundational understanding of his own worldview, then he must think about taking a more active role in seizing the culture. Seasoning his knowledge with prudence, the retrograde should identify what he believes to be the most pressing issues of the day, and it's okay and even salutary to have some variation here. He then needs to band together with other retrogrades interested in advocating those priority issues and form a group, or join one if a suitable one already exists. The retrograde must make a firm and realistic pledge of his time to the group going forward. It is insufficient to conditionally give time when it can be worked into the margins of one's schedule. The present state of cultural decay does not admit of dilettantism. Once the retrograde has involved himself with like-minded men, he and his companions must come up with a proposal for making headway on the identified issue, for ushering in the retrograde vision. Once a proposal is agreed upon, it should be formalized and written into an agenda with specific dates and times assigned for specific actions. The retrograde compatriots must continue to meet and should make every attempt to bring additional friends and acquaintances to their meetings so as to swell our numbers. For every retrograde issue, there must be permanent retrograde organization. This is the only efficacious sort of political involvement. Showing up at the polls and making idle chatter about politics is assumed. It's necessary, but not sufficient. The retrograde must also become a student of radicalism. Not only must he be well versed in his own literature, the retrograde must be just as well versed in radicals' literature. He must know precisely what it is that the radical believes and why the radical believes it. One is badly and unnecessarily handicapped in trying to fight an enemy that he doesn't quite understand. If retrogrades settle for a superficial knowledge of radicals' goals, we will never understand why it is that radicals do what they do as they're doing it. We'll never understand the method, the uniting cause underlying what might appear to the untrained eye as random and unconnected planks in their platform. One can only fight an enemy effectively when he understands the enemy's overarching goals. It's why America's policy of containment really did prove effective in bringing down communism. Our generals knew that, of its very nature, communism could not survive if it were not a worldwide system. It could not perdure if relegated to nation-states alone. Hence, by curtailing its spread, we were able to have it wither from inside out. We must apply the same general principle in defeating radicalism, understand its meta-strategy and its sine qua nons, and sketch out a way to sabotage it, like the Star Wars Rebel Alliance analyzing the Death Star plans to find and exploit a weakness. The foregoing are all mere examples of preparatory steps that retrogrades must take in advance of their entry into the political cultural wars. If we are to prevail, we must out-prepare and outwork our ideological enemy. We must eschew the complacency and passivity of modcons, which was at its zenith when the boomers lost the culture for us in the first place 50 years ago. If we inculcate discipline and commit ourselves to the tough path ahead, we give ourselves the chance to remake the West into a shining beacon on a hill.
And that was Rule 40 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left. by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you, and now the Mossad.
The ceiling fan rotated slowly above Rashid's workstation, barely moving the thick air inside Assembly Hall 3. It was just past midnight on October 23rd, and the night shift at the Yarmouk Military-Industrial Complex was in full swing. Rashid had been working at the facility for 8 months, and the rhythm had become routine. Arrive at 11, assemble components until dawn, collect his pay every 2 weeks, ask no questions about what exactly he was building. Tonight felt different. The Iranian engineers who usually supervised the assembly line had left early, around 10:30, which almost never happened. The facility manager had made an unusual announcement at shift start. Complete the current batch by 0200, then secure all materials and wait for further instructions. Rashid glanced at his colleague Ahmed, who was carefully fitting a guidance fin onto a cylindrical component. Neither man spoke. They'd both learned that curiosity could cost you your job, or worse. The work itself was precise. Each rocket component arrived from different sections of the complex, carefully labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to the assembly workers. Rashid's job was simple: connect Section A to Section B, torque the bolts to exact specifications, pass it down the line. He'd been told these were defensive munitions for Sudan's national security. He'd stopped believing that story around month 3, when he'd overheard 2 technicians speaking Farsi in the storage facility. The smell of rocket propellant hung heavy in the air, a chemical sweetness that made his head ache by the end of each shift. The storage buildings next door held hundreds of gallons of the stuff, maybe thousands. He'd seen the delivery trucks arrive at odd hours, always with minimal documentation, always with armed escorts. At 12:15, Rashid noticed something strange. His mobile phone, which he kept in his pocket despite regulations, had lost signal completely. Not just weak signal, nothing. He pulled it out and stared at the screen. No service. Ahmed's phone was the same. The facility's internal communication system crackled with static, then went silent. Rashid looked up at the ceiling. The lights flickered once. Then the air raid siren began to wail. He'd heard that siren tested during drills, but this was different. Longer, more urgent, not stopping. Ahmed stood up from his workstation, confusion spreading across his face. What's... The explosion hit before Ahmed could finish his sentence. Not the building they were in, but close, maybe 200 meters away. The blast wave rattled the walls, knocked tools off workbenches, sent unsecured components rolling across the concrete floor. Rashid's ears rang. The lights went out completely, replaced by emergency lighting that cast everything in hellish red. Then came the second explosion, and this one was massive. The propellant storage facility erupted in a fireball that lit up the night sky like a miniature sun. The shockwave hit Assembly Hall 3 with enough force to blow out every window simultaneously. Glass rained down on the workers as they dove for cover. Rashid hit the floor, arms over his head, feeling the building shake beneath him like an earthquake. The heat followed immediately, a wave of scorching air that made breathing painful. He could hear screaming now and the deep roar of secondary explosions as stored munitions began detonating in chain reaction. Something massive crashed through the roof 3 bays over, and suddenly half the building was open to the night sky. Rashid crawled toward the emergency exit, his hands sliced by broken glass, his lungs burning from chemical smoke. Ahmed was beside him, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. The emergency lighting flickered and died, plunging everything into chaos. The only illumination came from the fires raging across the complex, fires that revealed the twisted wreckage of buildings that had stood intact just minutes before. As Rashid stumbled out into the night, he looked up and saw nothing. No aircraft, no missiles, no tracers in the sky, just fire and smoke and destruction spreading across the Yarmouk complex like a disease. Whatever had hit them had come and gone in complete silence, invisible in the darkness, leaving only devastation in its wake. By sunrise, Sudan would blame Israel. Israel would say nothing, and Rashid would spend the rest of his life wondering what exactly he'd been building in that factory, and why someone had decided it needed to be destroyed. Before we find out how this attack was even possible, I want to let you know what this channel is really about. Every single day, I bring you real intelligence operations, not Hollywood fantasy, but actual missions, genuine tradecraft, and the strategic calculations that shape our world from the shadows. These are the operations that governments deny, the strikes that never officially happened, the shadow wars fought far from any declared battlefield. How did someone strike a weapons facility 1,100 miles from the nearest Israeli border without anyone seeing them coming? The Yarmouk military-industrial complex occupied 50 acres of land on the southern outskirts of Khartoum, officially registered as a facility for domestic arms production, serving Sudan's national defense requirements. The Sudanese government had promoted this story for years, hosting occasional media tours that showed workers assembling small arms and basic munitions. What those tours never revealed were the restricted sections of the complex, the buildings with Iranian-installed security systems, the specialized equipment that had nothing to do with rifle manufacturing. Israeli intelligence had been watching Yarmouk evolve for 3 years. Satellite imagery showed construction patterns that matched Iranian missile production facilities almost exactly, the same building layouts, the same security perimeters, the same blast walls positioned to contain accidental detonations. The Mossad had sources inside Sudan, people who noticed the foreign engineers arriving on short rotation deployments, people who saw the shipping containers marked with innocuous labels, but requiring armed military escorts from Port Sudan to Khartoum. Signals intelligence painted an even clearer picture. Communications intercepts revealed conversations in Farsi between facility supervisors and handlers in Tehran. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps wasn't just advising on the Yarmouk project, they were running it. The facility had become a critical node in Iran's weapons corridor to Gaza, a supply line that stretched from Iranian factories through Sudan, across the Sinai Peninsula, and into the tunnels beneath Gaza's border with Egypt. The weapons being assembled at Yarmouk weren't simple rockets. Intelligence indicated production of Fajr 5 and M302 systems, long-range munitions capable of reaching Tel Aviv from Gaza. These weren't weapons for Sudan's national defense. They were weapons designed to kill Israeli civilians, and they were being manufactured 1,500 miles from Iran to avoid the complications of direct shipping. By late 2012, Israeli intelligence analysts had mapped every building in the Yarmouk complex. They knew which structures held propellant storage, which housed final assembly operations, which contained the Iranian technical supervisors who oversaw quality control. Thermal imaging revealed the night shift operations, the unusual activity patterns that suggested covert production schedules. Human intelligence provided confirmation. Workers who talked to relatives, relatives who talked to contacts, contacts who eventually talked to Israeli handlers. The intelligence picture was complete. Yarmouk wasn't a Sudanese arms factory with Iranian assistance. It was an Iranian weapons production facility that happened to be located in Sudan, operating under Sudanese protection, producing munitions destined for terrorist organizations committed to Israel's destruction. Military intelligence presented their assessment to the Israeli Security Cabinet in early October. The facility was operational, production was accelerating, and the weapons would soon be en route to Gaza. Previous operations had focused on intercepting convoys and shipments, hitting trucks in the Sinai, stopping ships in the Red Sea, interdicting smuggling routes at the Gaza border. But those were tactical strikes, temporary disruptions. The weapons kept coming because the source kept producing them. Someone in that meeting room made a strategic calculation. Instead of fighting the symptom, destroy the disease. Instead of interdicting shipments, eliminate the production capability. Instead of stopping trucks carrying 50 rockets, destroy the factory that could produce thousands. The decision was made without fanfare, without public debate, without congressional authorization or international consultation. Authorization flowed through classified channels to the Israeli Air Force. The target package was prepared. The mission was planned. and the planning had to account for a fundamental problem: geography. Khartoum sits 1,100 miles south of Israel, deep in the African continent, far beyond the range of conventional strike operations. Egyptian airspace lay directly in the flight path, and Egypt in late 2012 was politically unstable, still reeling from the Arab Spring uprisings. Flying Israeli military aircraft through Egyptian territory would trigger diplomatic catastrophe, potentially military confrontation. The route was politically impossible. So Israeli mission planners looked at the map differently, not north to south through Egypt, but east to west across the Red Sea. The flight path would take aircraft out over international waters, exploiting radar coverage gaps along the Eritrean coast, approaching Khartoum from an unexpected direction. Sudan's air defenses were oriented toward potential threats from the north and east: Ethiopia, Eritrea, traditional regional rivals. Nobody was watching the Red Sea approach. But distance was only part of the problem. Sudan operated a network of radar installations and surface-to-air missile systems, mostly older Soviet equipment, but still functional enough to detect incoming aircraft. The mission would require electronic warfare capabilities sophisticated enough to blind those radars without Sudan realizing what was happening until the bombs were already falling. The Israeli Air Force had refined electronic attack doctrine through years of operations against more sophisticated adversaries: Syrian air defenses, Hezbollah surveillance networks, Iranian radar installations. Each operation had provided lessons about how to suppress, deceive, and penetrate defended airspace. Sudan's systems were less advanced, which meant the electronic warfare package could be more aggressive, more comprehensive. The technical details of how exactly Israel achieved electronic dominance over Khartoum that night remain classified, but the results spoke for themselves. Sudan's radar network functioned normally until approximately midnight on October 23rd, then experienced what operators would later describe as complete signal degradation. Not jamming, which would have been obvious and alarming, but something subtler: ghost returns, false contacts, system errors that made the displays unreliable enough that operators couldn't trust what they were seeing. The targeting package was equally precise. Israeli intelligence had identified the critical nodes within Yarmouk, the buildings that mattered operationally, the structures whose destruction would cripple the facility's production capacity. This wasn't going to be saturation bombing, carpet bombing an entire complex, and hoping you hit something important. This was surgical strike planning, building by building target selection, minimizing collateral damage while maximizing operational impact. The munitions were selected for precision and penetration, weapons capable of destroying hardened structures, triggering secondary explosions in stored munitions, creating the kind of catastrophic damage that couldn't be quickly repaired. The mission plan called for multiple aircraft, multiple attack runs if necessary, flexibility to adjust targeting based on real-time battle damage assessment. And then there was the attribution calculation, the strategic decision that would define the operation's aftermath. Israel had learned through decades of covert operations that sometimes the loudest message is silence. Confirming responsibility would invite international condemnation, UN Security Council resolutions, diplomatic complications. Denying responsibility would sound defensive and unconvincing, but saying nothing, maintaining complete ambiguity about who had just destroyed a weapons facility deep inside Sudan, that created a different kind of deterrence. Ambiguity meant that Iran would know what happened, but couldn't respond directly without confirming their own involvement in Yarmouk. Sudan would protest, but couldn't provide evidence without exposing what the facility really was. The international community would suspect, but couldn't prove. And the next time Iran considered building a weapons facility in some distant corner of the region, they'd have to factor in the possibility that it might explode without warning, without attribution, without any accountability. The mission authorization was finalized in mid-October. Weather conditions were monitored, clear skies preferred, minimal cloud cover over Khartoum. Intelligence updates continued flowing from Sudan, confirming that Yarmouk remained operational, that production schedules continued, that foreign technicians were still rotating through the facility. And then, on the night of October 22nd, aircraft began their final preparations at an undisclosed Israeli airbase. Pilots reviewed targeting packages, weapons officers loaded precision-guided munitions, electronic warfare officers programmed suppression sequences, refueling aircraft moved into position over international waters. At some point, between 10 p.m. and midnight, Israeli aircraft lifted off. They flew east, out over the Red Sea, maintaining radio silence, navigating by predetermined waypoints, refueling over water from tankers that would be back at base before sunrise. The formation turned south, following the African coast at distances that kept them beyond visual range of any casual observers. Sudan's radar operators saw nothing unusual. The electronic warfare package activated gradually, subtly, degrading sensor reliability without triggering obvious alarms. By the time Sudanese air defense commanders realized something was wrong, it was far too late. The aircraft approached Khartoum from the southwest, the direction nobody had been watching. They arrived over the Yarmouk complex at approximately 12:15 a.m., achieving complete tactical surprise. And then the bombing began. The first munitions hit the propellant storage facilities with devastating precision. The explosions triggered exactly what Israeli intelligence had predicted: catastrophic secondary detonations as hundreds of gallons of solid rocket fuel ignited simultaneously. The fireball lit up Khartoum's southern suburbs like daylight, visible from miles away, generating a mushroom cloud that rose thousands of feet into the night sky. The blast wave propagated outward at supersonic speed, shattering windows in residential neighborhoods 3 miles from the complex, knocking people out of their beds, triggering car alarms across entire districts. The sound was described by witnesses as rolling thunder that lasted for minutes, each secondary explosion adding to the cacophony. Inside the Yarmouk complex, the destruction was absolute. Assembly halls collapsed as their structural supports failed. Machine shops were obliterated. Storage warehouses erupted as their contents detonated. The fires burned with temperatures consistent with rocket propellant combustion, over 2,000 degrees, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to consume everything organic. Subsequent strikes hit additional targets within the complex. The pattern was methodical, professional, building by building elimination of critical infrastructure. Administrative offices were largely untouched, not operationally significant. Worker facilities, power substations, non-critical workshops, ignored. The targeting showed intimate knowledge of what mattered and what didn't, the kind of specificity that comes from months of intelligence preparation. Sudan's air defense network remained effectively blind throughout the attack. No surface-to-air missiles launched. No interceptor aircraft scrambled. The entire strike package completed its mission, turned northwest, and disappeared back across the Red Sea before Sudanese military commanders even understood what had happened. The fires continued burning through the night. Explosions continued sporadically as remaining munitions cooked off in the heat. First responders approaching the complex encountered choking smoke, overwhelming heat, unstable structures threatening to collapse. The scale of destruction was so comprehensive that immediate casualty assessment was impossible. Too much fire, too much smoke, too much chaos. By dawn, Sudanese officials stood at the perimeter of the Yarmouk complex, staring at the smoldering ruins of buildings that had been intact 12 hours earlier. Satellite phones were ringing in government offices across Khartoum. Ministers were being briefed. The president was being awakened with news that Sudan had just experienced a military strike that somehow nobody had detected until the bombs were already falling. The immediate question was obvious: who had done this? Sudan's military had enemies, border disputes with neighboring countries, internal conflicts with rebel groups. But this kind of precision strike, this level of operational sophistication, this degree of intelligence-driven targeting, only one country in the region possessed those capabilities. By 6 a.m., Sudan's foreign ministry was preparing a statement accusing Israel of an act of war. By 8 a.m., the accusation was public, broadcast on Sudanese state television, reported by international media. Israel's military censor office issued a standard instruction to Israeli media: no reporting on the incident beyond what had already been published internationally. The Israeli government issued no statement, no confirmation, no denial. Complete silence, strategic ambiguity, the message without words. The immediate aftermath of the Khartoum strike played out across multiple diplomatic channels simultaneously, each layer revealing different aspects of what had actually happened at Yarmouk and why the international response was so carefully calibrated. Sudan's accusations were immediate and unambiguous. 4 military aircraft had violated Sudanese airspace, attacked a legitimate defense facility, and committed an act of aggression against a sovereign nation. President Omar al-Bashir appeared on state television denouncing the strike as terrorism, promising consequences, calling for international condemnation of Israel's actions. Israel's response arrived in the form of absolute silence. No government spokesperson confirmed or denied involvement. No military official offered commentary. The Israeli Defense Forces' routine operational updates made no mention of any activities outside Israeli territory. When international journalists pressed Israeli officials for reaction, they received only variations of, "We don't comment on foreign reports." This silence was strategic, carefully calculated, and far more powerful than any official statement could have been. Confirmation would have invited UN Security Council resolutions, international sanctions discussions, diplomatic complications. Denial would have sounded defensive and been universally disbelieved. But silence created a different dynamic entirely. The silence said, "We're not confirming because we don't need to. Everyone knows what happened. Everyone understands the message. Whether we officially acknowledge it or not changes nothing about the operational reality that a weapons facility in Khartoum has been destroyed." The United States declined to comment on the strike, a diplomatic non-response that spoke volumes. American satellites had undoubtedly tracked whatever aircraft had crossed the Red Sea that night. American intelligence had certainly observed the operation unfold in real time. The State Department's refusal to either condemn or endorse the attack signaled tacit acceptance, a message to regional actors that Washington wouldn't interfere with Israeli actions against weapons proliferation networks. Iran's response was more revealing than Tehran intended. Iranian officials condemned the attack indirectly, calling it aggression against a sovereign state without specifically mentioning Israel or Yarmouk. The careful phrasing betrayed Iran's dilemma. Condemning the strike too vigorously would confirm Iranian involvement in the facility, while remaining silent would signal acceptance of attacks against Iranian overseas infrastructure. The wreckage itself told a story that Sudan couldn't fully control. International journalists who managed to reach the site before security restrictions were fully imposed photographed debris that contradicted Sudan's narrative. The blast patterns were consistent with high explosive munitions, not accidental explosions. The selective destruction, certain buildings obliterated while others remained standing, indicated precision targeting, not random violence. And the chemical signatures in the fires suggested solid rocket propellant, not conventional ammunition. Satellite imagery analyzed by independent defense analysts showed even more. The before and after comparison revealed that specific structures within the Yarmouk complex had been destroyed while surrounding buildings remained mostly intact. The targeting pattern matched facilities consistent with weapons production and storage, not general industrial infrastructure. The assessment was clear. Whoever had struck Yarmouk knew exactly what they were hitting and why. What Sudan never did was equally significant. Despite loud public accusations and demands for international action, Sudan never formally requested a UN investigation, never submitted radar data showing the attacking aircraft, never provided debris samples for international analysis, never allowed independent inspectors to examine the wreckage. The absence of any serious effort to build a legal case suggested that Sudan couldn't afford international scrutiny of what Yarmouk had actually been doing. The casualty count remained deliberately vague. Sudan's official statement reported 2 deaths and several injuries, figures that seemed impossibly low given the scale of destruction. Hospital intake logs told a different story. Multiple burn victims admitted through the night, military personnel with blast injuries, a morgue that processed more bodies than official figures acknowledged. The silence around foreign casualties was even more conspicuous. Intelligence reports indicated that Iranian engineers had been working at Yarmouk, along with technical specialists from other countries. None of those nations acknowledged having personnel at the facility. None reported casualties. The implication was clear. Acknowledging casualties would mean acknowledging involvement in weapons production for terrorist organizations, a political cost that nobody wanted to pay. Within weeks, the strategic impact of the Khartoum strike became apparent. Iranian personnel began quietly withdrawing from similar facilities across Sudan. The weapons pipeline from Tehran to Gaza experienced disruption, not complete shutdown but significant reduction in flow. Shipments that had moved through Sudanese territory began shifting to maritime routes, slower, more expensive, more exposed to interdiction. The operation achieved its objective without firing a shot beyond the initial strike. The physical destruction of Yarmouk was significant, but the psychological impact was greater. Iran's overseas weapons infrastructure, previously considered safe because of its distance from Israel, had been proven vulnerable. The message was unmistakable. Distance provides no protection, sovereignty provides no immunity, and facilities supporting terrorism can be destroyed regardless of their location. Sudan's subsequent actions confirmed the strike's effectiveness. Over the following months, Khartoum began distancing itself from Tehran. Security was quietly tightened around remaining military installations. Iranian access to Sudanese facilities became more restricted. The weapons corridor that had run through Sudan for years began to close, not through diplomatic pressure or international sanctions, but through strategic violence that made the arrangement too costly to maintain. But there was a human dimension to this operation that intelligence briefings and targeting packages never fully captured. The workers at Yarmouk, the Rashids and Ahmeds, who assembled components without fully understanding what they were building, they paid the price for decisions made in Tehran and Tel Aviv. Some survived with injuries that would last a lifetime. Others died never knowing that the civilian factory job they'd taken to support their families had placed them at the center of a shadow war between regional powers. The Iranian engineers who'd rotated through Yarmouk, providing technical expertise and quality control, some of them died in the strike as well. They'd been following orders from the Revolutionary Guard Corps, serving Iran's strategic objectives in the confrontation with Israel. They'd believed they were safe in Sudan, protected by distance and sovereignty. That belief was incinerated along with the facility. And the Sudanese military personnel who'd provided security at Yarmouk, who'd escorted shipments and guarded perimeters, they'd been serving their government, following assignments, doing their jobs. The operation that destroyed Yarmouk didn't distinguish between willing participants and those just following orders. The precision of the strike referred to targeting accuracy, not moral calibration. This raises questions that have no clean answers. The weapons being produced at Yarmouk were destined for Gaza, where they would have been used to attack Israeli cities, where they would have killed Israeli civilians indiscriminately. The strategic calculus was simple. Destroy the facility before those weapons could be deployed, save Israeli lives that would have been lost to rocket attacks, preemptive action against a clear threat. But the workers at Yarmouk, were they legitimate military targets? The Iranian engineers were clearly combatants in the broader conflict, but what about the Sudanese laborers who assembled components for a paycheck? What about the night shift supervisor who managed production schedules? What about the maintenance workers who kept the facility running? International law provides frameworks for these questions, concepts like proportionality and distinction between combatants and civilians. But those frameworks assume conventional warfare with clear battle lines and uniformed soldiers. The reality of modern conflict is messier. Weapons factories staffed by civilian workers, production facilities embedded in urban areas, intelligence operations conducted through front companies and cutouts. Here's what happened next in Sudan. The immediate crisis response focused on securing the perimeter, fighting fires, accounting for personnel. But within days, a quieter reckoning began. Sudanese intelligence officers started asking uncomfortable questions about the facility's actual operations. Military commanders wanted to know why air defenses had failed so completely. Government officials began calculating the political and economic costs of continuing their relationship with Iran. The Khartoum strike occurred during a period of economic hardship in Sudan. International sanctions related to Darfur had isolated the country financially. Oil revenues were declining after South Sudan's independence. Sudan needed international rehabilitation, needed sanctions relief, needed economic relationships with Western powers. Hosting Iranian weapons facilities was incompatible with those goals. Over the following months, a strategic reassessment occurred in Khartoum. The benefits of the Iranian relationship, financial support, military cooperation, ideological alignment, were weighed against the costs, international isolation, economic sanctions, the risk of additional Israeli strikes. The calculation shifted. By 2013, Sudan began quietly reducing Iranian access to its military facilities. By 2015, the relationship had cooled significantly. By 2016, Sudan formally severed diplomatic relations with Iran. Intelligence officials on multiple sides of this conflict privately acknowledged that the Yarmouk strike was the catalyst for Sudan's pivot away from Iran. The operation didn't just destroy a weapons facility, it broke a strategic alliance that had lasted for years. One night of precision bombing reshaped regional geopolitical alignments in ways that years of diplomacy hadn't achieved. For Israel, the operation represented a doctrinal evolution. Previous strikes against weapons smuggling networks had focused on interdiction, stopping convoys in the Sinai, boarding ships in the Red Sea, destroying tunnels at the Gaza border. Those were tactical actions that disrupted weapons flow temporarily, but didn't address the source. Khartoum was different. Khartoum struck at production infrastructure, eliminating capability rather than just blocking delivery. The shift from interdiction to infrastructure destruction had strategic implications that extended far beyond Sudan. Iran operated weapons production facilities in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, and other locations across the region. The message from Khartoum was clear. None of those facilities were safe, regardless of their location. Distance from Israel provided no protection. Host country sovereignty provided no immunity. If a facility was producing weapons for use against Israel, it was a legitimate target, period. The timing of the Khartoum strike was also significant. 3 weeks later, Israel launched Operation Pillar of Defense, a major military campaign in Gaza responding to escalating rocket attacks. During that operation, Hamas and other militant groups fired over 1,500 rockets at Israeli territory. But intelligence assessments noted that the rocket arsenal was notably depleted compared to projections from earlier in the year. The advanced long-range systems that had been in production at Yarmouk never made it to Gaza. The strike didn't prevent the conflict, but it limited the weapons available to Israel's adversaries. Comparing Khartoum to previous Israeli operations reveals the evolution of long-range strike doctrine. Operation Orchard in 2007 destroyed a suspected Syrian nuclear facility, an existential threat that justified extreme operational risk. That strike was about preventing Syria from acquiring nuclear weapons, a red line that could not be crossed. Khartoum was different. Not existential prevention, but strategic shaping. Not eliminating a weapons of mass destruction program, but disrupting a conventional weapons supply chain. The Red Sea interdiction operations that Israel conducted from 2009 through 2021 focused on tactical disruption, stopping specific shipments, boarding specific vessels, destroying specific convoys. Those operations were highly effective but required constant repetition. Every shipment interdicted was a temporary victory followed by the next shipment to intercept. Khartoum represented a different approach. Destroy the factory and the shipments stop altogether. The technical execution of the Khartoum strike demonstrated capabilities that few countries possess.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a moment. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.